All right, so today we're going deep on Albert the Great,
Ooh, fun.
a really big name from the Middle Ages.
Huge.
Yeah, and everyone knows about Thomas Aquinas,
Right.
but you could argue that Albert's influence is even bigger.
Interesting.
And I think that's what makes him so fascinating for our deep dive today.
For sure.
Because, our listeners are super into connecting the dots and really getting philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Albert, he was all about finding these surprising connections between different fields.
He really was.
So today we're going to use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide and try to distill, the most important stuff from Albert's work.
Sounds good.
We want to give you those aha moments without getting too bogged down in the weeds.
Right. Make it digestible.
Exactly. And we're going to see how this 13th century mind tackled some of the biggest questions out there.
I mean, the range of this guy is just incredible.
Right. So where do we even begin with a figure like this?
Well, I think what really grabs you right away is just how much ground Albert covered intellectually.
Yeah, he wasn't just reading these thinkers. He was wrestling with them.
Totally. And trying to weave their ideas together in new ways.
It's like he was building this huge intellectual tapestry.
Exactly. And his work with Aristotle is a perfect example.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
So he really wanted to get Aristotle not just through, the Arab commentators.
Right, which were super important at the time.
Huge. But he wanted to go straight to the source.
So primary sources all the way.
Exactly. And that led to this massive project of synthesis that really shaped medieval philosophy.
Wow. So let's back up a bit and talk about Albert's life.
Sure.
So he was born around the year 1200 in Germany.
Okay.
And then went to Italy to study.
Makes sense.
Must have been some wild experiences back then, traveling like that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then, boom, he decides to join the Dominican order.
Now, that's a big turning point.
Right. It totally set him on this path of intense study and teaching all across Europe.
And think about the energy it took to travel and do all that scholarship back then.
It's mind-blowing. And joining the Dominicans, that wasn't just, a random choice.
No, not at all.
They were at the cutting edge of bringing back classical thought into the Christian world.
They were like the cool kids on the block.
Right. And so while he's in Paris lecturing on Peter Lombard,
Which was like Theology 101 back then.
he starts working on his own Summa,
The Summa Parisiensis.
that one.
Yeah, massive undertaking.
And of course, this is where he meets Thomas Aquinas.
A legendary pairing.
Seriously, a turning point in Western thought.
For sure.
Then in 1248, Albert gets appointed to lead the Dominican Studium Generale in Cologne.
Okay, big promotion.
He brings Aquinas with him.
Of course.
And this is when he really dives into paraphrasing all of Aristotle's works,
Like all of them.
as much as he could get his hands on.
That's wild.
Talk about ambitious.
No kidding.
But wait, there's more.
Always more with Albert.
He becomes the Dominican provincial for Germany.
So now he's like the boss.
Yeah, tons of traveling administrative duties.
Keeping busy.
Then he's made a bishop, tries to reform his diocese.
and
And then he's asked to preach the crusade.
talk about a full resume.
Seriously, but here's the thing. Even with all that church stuff going on,
Yeah.
he never stopped writing.
The man was a machine.
And all that travel probably fed into his scientific work, too.
Right, seeing the world firsthand.
Exactly. And centuries later, he's made a saint
St. Albert the Great.
and the patron saint of natural sciences.
It's like his whole life was pointing to that.
Totally. So we've got this philosophical encyclopedia that Albert creates.
Wait, what exactly does that even mean?
Right, because it's more than just summarizing Aristotle.
For sure.
So for someone who's really into philosophical method,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway here?
The big thing is that Albert was actively engaging with these texts, not just copying them.
So he's paraphrasing, explaining, offering his own take.
Exactly. And when he found gaps in Aristotle,
Like Aristotle forgot to write something.
he filled them in with what he thought Aristotle should have said.
That's bold.
It is, but it shows how deeply he understood Aristotle.
That's fascinating. And it wasn't just Aristotle either, right?
No way he tackled Porphyry Boethius,
Yeah.
the Liber de Causis, Pseudo-Dionysius, tons of biblical commentaries.
It's like he was building this intellectual cathedral.
Grand synthesis of all the major thinkers.
Okay, so how did he deal with bringing in Aristotle?
Yeah, that was tricky.
Because a lot of it came through Arab scholars.
Right, and some people were nervous about that.
Non-Christian ideas sneaking in.
Yeah.
So how did Albert deal with that tension?
He and Aquinas made this really powerful argument that Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology could work together.
Okay.
They said that Aristotle's method, which was all about observation and reasoning,
Inductive and deductive.
both was totally separate from Christian theology, which is based on revelation.
So two different ways of knowing.
Exactly. And Albert was very clear that these are autonomous domains.
Like separate but equal.
Yeah. Philosophy based on reason doesn't have to undermine faith, and faith doesn't negate reason.
That's a game changer.
Totally. It opened up space for philosophy to flourish within a religious context.
Okay, so you mentioned Neoplatonism before.
Oh, yeah.
How it did play into his work with Aristotle?
Well, it's super interesting how Albert kind of puts Aristotle inside this bigger Neoplatonic framework.
A framework for the framework.
Yeah, he was really influenced by Pseudo-Dionysius and the Liber de Causis.
Those are some big names.
You know,
And he saw reality through this Neoplatonic lens of exodus, perfectio, and reductio.
emanation, perfection, and return to the source.
It's like a cosmic dance.
Right. And he used that to make sense of Aristotle's observations about the natural world.
Okay, but here's the key thing, right?
Yeah.
He insisted that science has to be based on evidence and the study of secondary causes. So that Neoplatonism is like the big picture.
Right, the grand division.
But the details of the world, you got to figure those out through observation and reason.
Exactly.
Okay, let's get specific.
Love it.
What about logic?
All right.
How did Albert tackle the problem of universals?
Oh, man, that's a classic philosophical puzzle.
And Albert's take on it is super interesting.
It really is.
It's like he takes all this stuff from his paraphrases of Aristotle
Yeah.
and comes up with this really nuanced approach.
Totally. So first he defines a universal as something that exists in one thing but can also be in many things
Okay.
and can be predicated of them.
Got it.
Then he makes this key distinction.
Hit me with it.
There's the universal anti-rem.
Before things.
Yeah, like a blueprint or an archetype.
Okay.
Then there's the universal in re,
In things.
right? The common nature that's shared by all the particulars.
Okay, I'm following.
And finally, the universal post-rem.
After things.
Yep, the concept that our minds abstract from those particulars.
All right, so for a philosopher who's trying to wrap their head around realism and nominalism,
Yeah.
how does this help?
It's brilliant because Albert's framework kind of sidesteps that whole debate.
Okay.
He says that the way a universal exists depends on how you're looking at it.
Interesting.
So in itself, it has real existence independent of things and minds. But in relation to the intellect, it exists in two ways, either as the basis for understanding or as the concept we understand.
I see.
And when it's in particular things, it's outside the mind, but it's individuated in those specific things.
So it's like he's saying universals are real, but not in this like otherworldly Platonic way.
Exactly. It's more grounded in the Aristotelian idea that form is in things.
That's really clever.
He was a clever guy.
Okay, so what about metaphysics? How did Albert see the nature of reality itself?
Buckle up, because this is where it gets really wild.
I'm ready.
So Albert's metaphysics, it's this amazing blend of Aristotle and Neoplatonism.
A greatest hits album.
Right. But part of that Neoplatonic influence came from him thinking that the Liber de Causis was written by Aristotle.
Oh, whoops.
Yeah, a little bit of a scholarly mix-up.
Happens to the best of us.
But anyway, he sees reality as this hierarchical structure driven by what he calls the advocatio boni,
The summoning of the good.
right? And this good is both the first cause, the ultimate source of everything, and the final cause, the purpose towards which everything is drawn.
So it's teleological, but with a Neoplatonic spin?
You got it. But remember, Albert's also a Christian thinker.
Right.
So he integrates this with the idea of creation.
Okay. How does that work?
He says that God, the totally transcendent first cause, brings forth the universe through his uncreated light.
Let there be light.
Exactly. And at the top of this hierarchy, you've got purely spiritual beings.
Angels and intelligences.
Right. And he's very careful to distinguish between those two.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, the intelligences, they're the ones moving the celestial spheres.
Like the cosmic movers and shakers.
Yeah. And they also illuminate the human intellect.
Okay, so where do we fit into all of this?
So below the angels and intelligences, you have souls with intellects.
Us.
Yep. And these souls are joined to bodies, but they can exist independently of them.
Okay.
And Albert totally rejected that Averroistic idea of a single unified intellect for all humanity.
One mind for everyone.
Yeah, he said, nope. Each human soul has its own distinct intellect.
Individual minds.
And he saw the human soul as this bridge between the material and spiritual worlds.
Like a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm.
Exactly. And one more thing. He also argued against Aristotle and Averroes on the idea of unity.
What do you mean?
Well, he said, following Avicenna, that unity isn't an essential feature of every substance.
Interesting. So things can exist without being perfectly unified.
Right.
Okay, so let's dig deeper into Albert's understanding of human beings.
Sounds good.
What about his psychology and anthropology?
All right, so for Albert, the intellect is like the defining feature of what it means to be human.
It's what makes us us.
He actually said that humanity is essentially identified with its intellect.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is. And
Yeah.
when it comes to the soul-body relationship, he walks this really interesting line.
Okay.
He takes inspiration from Plato's idea of the soul's independence,
Right.
but also from Aristotle's view of the soul as the form of the body.
So he's trying to synthesize those two.
He is, and he leans towards Avicenna's emphasis on the soul's function.
So what does the soul do?
Well, it's the efficient cause of the body. It governs it kind of like how God governs the universe.
That's a cool analogy.
And he also stresses that the soul can operate independently, especially the intellect.
Okay, so how did he break down the workings of the intellect itself?
Well, he follows Aristotle in dividing it into the agent intellect and the possible intellect.
Okay, remind me what those are.
So the agent intellect is like the active part that does the thinking.
Okay.
And the possible intellect is the part that receives knowledge.
Got it.
And Albert says that neither of them needs the body to exist.
They're immaterial.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And he describes this process of intellectual development where the possible intellect, under the influence of the agent intellect, can reach its full potential.
Okay.
And he calls this the adept intellect.
Intellectus adeptus.
Yep. A state of mastery over all the knowledge you've acquired.
Impressive.
And then if you get even more illumination from those higher intelligences,
The angels and stuff.
you can reach the assimilated intellect.
Intellectus assimilativus.
That's the one. And that's like the highest form of natural human happiness.
Sounds blissful.
Total intellectual harmony with the cosmos.
But then he also brings in this Augustinian idea of the inner teacher.
Right. Divine truth, helping us understand.
So it's like a mix of Aristotle and Augustine.
Albert was all about synthesis.
But did his views on this change over time?
It seems like there's a subtle shift.
Okay.
In his earlier works, he really stressed that you need divine illumination even to understand the natural world.
Okay.
But in his later Summa, he focuses more on the different roles of natural reason and revelation.
Interesting.
He uses this analogy of different kinds of light.
Okay, tell me about that.
So there's natural light for understanding nature,
Makes sense.
gratuitous light for faith and belief,
Okay.
and the light of glory for the beatific vision.
Wow, so like a whole spectrum of light.
Right. And while he doesn't completely ditch the inner teacher for natural knowledge, his later work is more about drawing boundaries between natural and supernatural ways of knowing.
So he's refining his thinking.
Always.
Now, we can't forget that Albert was also a big fan of the natural world.
Oh yeah, he was a scientist at heart,
He actually argued that science is a legitimate form of knowledge.
which wasn't a given back then.
Right. Some people thought it was kind of suspect.
Yeah. But Albert said that even though science doesn't deal with individual fleeting things,
Like this particular leaf or that particular rock.
right, it can still study the species those things belong to,
Okay.
because species have demonstrable necessary causes.
Got it.
And this belief led him to do a ton of empirical research.
He didn't just sit in his study reading books.
Nope. He went out and looked at the world,
What a concept.
and he wasn't just relying on old authorities.
He was testing things for himself.
Exactly. He wanted to see with his own eyes.
What are some examples of his scientific work?
Well, his treatise on minerals isn't just a rehash of old ideas. It's full of his own observations about different minerals and metals.
Like what kind of stuff?
He talks about where they're found, their properties, even tries to explain why they are the way they are.
Cool.
And his treatise on plants brings together classical knowledge with his own botanical observations.
So he's building on tradition, but also adding his own insights?
Exactly. And he even has sections on plant cultivation and how the stars influence plant growth.
Wow, that's way ahead of his time.
Right. And then there's his massive treatise on animals.
This guy wrote a lot.
It combines Aristotle's zoology with other sources and his own super detailed studies of animals.
What was he looking at?
He was trying to figure out the causes of animal traits based on their behavior, anatomy, and abilities.
And he was actually testing things out.
He was a big believer in verifying what the authorities said through experience.
That's remarkable for the 13th century.
It really is.
Okay, so how did his understanding of human nature shape his ethics,
Well, it all starts with his unique view of free will.
which he called liberum arbitrium?
Yep. And he saw this as separate from both intellect and will.
Okay.
It's the faculty that actually makes the choice between the options presented by the intellect and desired by the will.
So it's like the decider.
Exactly. And he thought this capacity for free choice was a key part of what makes us human.
It sets us apart from other animals.
Right. And even though his ideas about liberum arbitrium developed over time,
Okay.
that core idea of a distinct faculty of choice stayed central to his ethics.
Okay, so how did he see ethics as a field of study?
Well, he argued that it could be a theoretical deductive science.
Interesting.
Yeah, because he thought moral actions, or rations morum, are based on universal principles.
So there's a logic to morality.
Exactly. And he distinguished between those underlying principles and just the way people happen to act.
So like the difference between real virtue and just appearing virtuous?
Exactly. And he thought we could analyze concepts like virtue and justice abstractly.
But he also knew that we have to apply this knowledge to real life.
Right. Theory and practice have to go together.
So how did he reconcile those two?
He made this distinction between ethica docens.
Ethics as doctrine.
Yep, focused on teaching and knowledge, and ethica usens.
Ethics as practical activity.
Right, focused on action and persuasion.
And what linked those two together?
Prudence.
Ah, the virtue of wise decision-making.
Exactly.
So what did Albert see as the ultimate goal of ethical life?
He believed that the contemplative life was the highest form of happiness we can achieve in this world.
Interesting. So it's all about intellectual contemplation.
Yeah, he saw the development of the adept intellect as the ultimate human aspiration.
Okay.
And this contemplation of separated beings, those immaterial things above the material realm, it leads to a detachment from worldly concerns.
So it's like a kind of earthly bliss.
Yeah, you achieve a state that's close to beatitude, but still within the limits of our earthly existence.
That's a pretty lofty goal.
It is.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
A lot.
But there's no doubt that Albert the Great had a huge impact on Western thought. What do you think his legacy is for later philosophers?
I think his influence is immeasurable.
Okay.
He and Aquinas completely reshaped scholastic philosophy by bringing in Aristotle.
A dynamic duo.
For sure. And beyond Aquinas, he taught so many influential thinkers.
A whole generation of philosophers.
And his ideas resonated with later German scholars like Dietrich of Freiburg and Meister Eckhart.
And even Renaissance thinkers were drawn to his Neoplatonism and his scientific work. It's like he planted the seeds for so much that came after him.
It really did.
So looking back at Albert's work, what really stands out to you?
I think it's his drive to connect everything.
He was a master synthesizer.
And for philosophers today, his approach is such a great example of how to engage with different intellectual traditions.
And not just engage, but weave them together.
Exactly. And his dedication to both reason and observation, that's a model for pursuing truth in any field.
Totally.
Yeah.
So on that note, here's something for our listeners to ponder. Albert the Great tried to find connections between logic and the cosmos, between all these different areas of knowledge.
Right.
But we live in a world that's becoming more and more specialized.
Yeah, super specialized.
So what can we learn from Albert's ambition to synthesize knowledge?
That's a great question.
How can we embrace that spirit of broad inquiry and find those connections that might be hidden from us?
It's like looking for the bigger picture.
Exactly. And maybe if we do that, we'll discover some surprising new insights and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Food for thought.
Definitely something to keep in mind long after this deep dive is over.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And until next time, keep diving deep.
Happy diving, everyone.